They mocked him long before they ever understood him. Not loudly at first, not openly, but in the quiet, dismissive way men use when they believe someone is beneath their notice. Corporal Eli Turner was a mechanic, and in the rigid hierarchy of wartime military culture that placed him firmly outside the circle of men whose opinions mattered. He fixed engines. He cleaned fuel lines. He crawled under trucks in the mud while others trained with rifles and maps. His hands were always stained with grease, his uniform never quite sharp enough, his boots perpetually worn down at the heels. To the officers, he was replaceable. To the infantry, he was invisible. And to the war itself, he was assumed to be irrelevant. Turner had not joined the army to become a hero. He had joined because machines made sense to him in a world that often didn't. Before the war, he had worked in a small auto shop outside Toledo, fixing farm tractors, delivery trucks, and the occasional luxury car that passed through town like a visitor from another world. He understood metal the way some men understood language. He could hear a misaligned piston the way a musician hears a wrong note. When an engine failed, he didn't curse it, he listened to it. That habit followed him into uniform. The base where Turner was stationed sat on the edge of a muddy European airfield, its runways scarred by constant use and half-repaired bomb craters. Aircraft came in damaged and left patched together, flying on borrowed time. The official doctrine was speed, fix it fast, get it back in the air, hope it survives the next mission. Turner hated that doctrine. He saw patterns others ignored. Engines overheating in the same way, fuel pumps failing under identical conditions. Pilots reporting power loss at specific altitudes, always dismissed as combat stress or poor handling. Turner kept notes in a small, oil-stained notebook he carried in his breast pocket, writing observations late at night under weak yellow bulbs while others drank or slept. He began to suspect something fundamental was wrong, not with the pilots, not with enemy fire, but with the machines themselves. More specifically, with how they were being used. Turner noticed that bomber engines were being pushed beyond safe limits for extended periods, especially during long escort missions. The standard procedures demanded constant high output, regardless of altitude or air density. Manuals written back home didn't account for European winter air, icing conditions, or the cumulative strain of repeated missions without full overhauls. Turner saw it clearly. The engines weren't failing because they were poorly built. They were failing because the doctrine behind their use was flawed. He tried to explain this once to a lieutenant during a routine inspection. The lieutenant listened politely for less than a minute before interrupting. "Stick to your tools, Corporal," he said, tapping Turner's grease-stained notebook. "Engineering decisions are made by people a lot higher up than you." That sentence would follow Turner for months. Still he kept working. Still he kept watching. And slowly an idea began to form, not a grand invention, not a revolutionary machine, but a small adjustment. A change in how engines regulated power output during climb and cruise. A way to redistribute stress, to prevent the cascading failures he kept seeing. It was the kind of idea that didn't look impressive on paper, didn't sound heroic, and didn't fit neatly into any existing doctrine. It was practical, quiet, and deeply threatening to people whose authority depended on not being questioned. Turner began testing his idea in secret. At night, after official repairs were logged and the hangars grew quiet, he adjusted throttle linkages and modified airflow channels on a single bomber assigned to routine transport duty. He didn't change enough to be obvious, just enough to test his theory. He logged everything meticulously: temperatures, vibration patterns, fuel efficiency. Over the next few weeks, that bomber flew mission after mission without a single mechanical failure. Pilots reported smoother climbs, better responsiveness, and reduced engine strain. Turner watched from the ground as the aircraft returned intact, while others limped back smoking or failed to return at all. He tried again to raise the issue, this time with data. The response was worse. A major summoned him into an office and closed the door. The tone was calm but dangerous. Turner was told that unauthorized modifications were unacceptable, that war was not a laboratory, and that his job was to follow orders, not rewrite doctrine. "Do you understand how many people have died developing these procedures?" the major asked. Turner did understand. That was the problem. From that day forward, Turner was watched more closely. His requests were delayed, his access restricted. Men joked openly now, calling him professor and asking if he planned to invent a new war while he was at it. The mocking no longer hid behind politeness. It sharpened. Then the losses accelerated. A week later, 3 bombers from the same squadron failed to return from a long-range mission. Post-mission reports cited engine failure at altitude, icing complications, power loss during evasive maneuvers. Turner read the reports with a hollow feeling in his chest. Every failure followed the pattern he had documented. Every death felt preventable. The breaking point came during a storm. A heavily loaded bomber attempted takeoff in freezing rain, engines straining under full power. Turner watched from the edge of the runway as one engine sputtered, then another. The aircraft veered, barely lifting off before crashing beyond the perimeter fence in a fireball that lit the gray sky orange. Turner ran toward the wreckage before anyone told him to. He didn't see heroism or sacrifice. He saw a system refusing to adapt. That night, he made a decision that would change everything. If they wouldn't listen to him, he would force them to. Turner selected another aircraft, this one scheduled for a critical mission the next morning. He worked through the night, hands numb from cold, modifying engine controls with surgical precision. He knew the risks. If he was wrong, the plane would fail catastrophically. If he was right, the results would be undeniable. The aircraft took off at dawn. Turner stood alone near the hangar, watching it climb into the clouds, his stomach tight with fear and conviction. Hours later, it returned, undamaged, engines running clean, fuel reserves higher than expected. The crew was shaken, not by danger, but by how smoothly the aircraft had performed under conditions that had destroyed others. This time, the data couldn't be ignored. Within days, engineers arrived from headquarters. Not mechanics, engineers. Men with clean hands and authoritative voices who spoke Turner's language but had never worked under a frozen wing in the rain. They examined the modifications, ran simulations, compared mission data. Slowly, grudgingly, recognition crept in. Turner was called in again. This time, no one told him to stick to his tools. The room was quiet as he explained his idea from start to finish, every word grounded in evidence, every sentence born from observation rather than theory. When he finished, no one laughed, no one dismissed him. The war, relentless and indifferent, had sided with the mechanic. What Turner didn't yet realize was that his idea, simple, unglamorous, and born in a muddy hangar, would soon be scaled across entire fleets, that it would reduce aircraft losses, extend mission range, and quietly reshape how air power was used, that it would save lives not by changing weapons, but by changing assumptions. They had mocked the mechanic. They would soon build the war around his idea. The first thing Turner noticed was how uncomfortable everyone suddenly seemed around him. Not hostile, unsettled. Officers who once dismissed him now paused mid-sentence when he entered a room. Engineers from headquarters asked him questions carefully, as if worried that listening too closely might imply agreement. His idea, once laughed off as the meddling of a grease-stained corporal, had crossed a dangerous threshold. It no longer belonged solely to him. It had become something that threatened established doctrine, reputations, and careers. The tests began quietly. Officially, they were labeled as routine performance evaluations, buried under layers of paperwork and technical language. Unofficially, everyone involved understood what was happening. Turner's modifications were applied to a small number of aircraft, never enough to draw attention, never enough to suggest a shift in policy. The planes were assigned to missions that mirrored the worst conditions: long range, high altitude, poor weather. The war itself became the proving ground. Turner wasn't allowed in the air. He stayed on the ground, watching aircraft lift into hostile skies, knowing that every mile they flew was a judgment passed on his work. He waited through long hours with a pit in his stomach, listening to radios crackle with partial reports, knowing that silence could mean success or catastrophe. When the planes returned, intact and running smoother than their counterparts, he felt no triumph, only relief, the kind that comes when reality aligns with belief. But success, Turner quickly learned, did not guarantee acceptance. Some officers argued the results were coincidence. Others claimed pilots flew differently when they believed their aircraft had been improved, attributing performance gains to confidence rather than engineering. A few suggested that the enemy had simply been less effective during those missions. Turner listened to every argument, responding only when asked, always with data. Temperatures, fuel consumption, failure rates. Numbers did not care about pride. Resistance hardened as evidence mounted. The problem wasn't that Turner's idea didn't work. It was that it worked too well. It implied that years of training manuals, procedures, and assumptions had been flawed. That men had died not because war was unpredictable, but because doctrine had been inflexible. No officer wanted to carry that implication on his shoulders. Then the war intervened. A major offensive was scheduled, long-range bombing deep into enemy territory, pushing aircraft to the absolute limits of endurance. Loss projections were grim. Command anticipated mechanical failures, forced landings, and heavy casualties. In the quiet meetings that preceded the operation, Turner's name surfaced again, reluctantly at first, then with growing urgency. A compromise was reached. Half the bombers would fly with Turner's modifications. Half would fly as they always had. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood what that meant. This wasn't just a test. It was a comparison written in lives. The night before the mission, Turner walked alone along the edge of the runway. Engines were already being warmed, the air thick with fuel fumes and tension. He passed crews loading bombs, checking instruments, writing letters they hoped wouldn't be their last. Some of the men nodded to him now, recognition flickering behind tired eyes. They didn't know the details of his idea, but they knew one thing: the aircraft he touched tended to come back. At dawn, the bombers lifted into the sky in long, trembling lines. Turner watched until the last one vanished into cloud, then turned away. There was nothing more he could do. The hours that followed stretched endlessly. Radios brought fragmented reports: enemy resistance, heavy flak, icing at altitude, mechanical strain. Turner listened with a technician's ear, parsing every phrase for meaning. When reports of engine trouble came in, he noted which aircraft were affected. The pattern was unmistakable. Aircraft without the modifications began dropping out early. Forced landings, abortions, engine failures that cascaded exactly as Turner had predicted months earlier. The modified aircraft pushed on, not effortlessly, not without danger, but within tolerances that made survival possible. When the first bombers returned, the airfield erupted into controlled chaos. Medics rushed forward. Ground crews swarmed. Turner stayed back, watching engines spin down, listening to how they cooled, how they settled. The modified aircraft returned in far greater numbers. Crews climbed out exhausted but alive, their machines battered but functional. By nightfall, the results were undeniable. Losses among the unmodified aircraft were catastrophic. Losses among Turner's were dramatically lower. Not zero, war did not allow perfection, but reduced enough to alter the entire calculus of air warfare. The room where the debriefing took place was silent as the data was laid out. Charts replaced arguments, numbers replaced opinions. Turner sat at the end of the table, hands folded, grease still embedded in the creases of his skin. No one mocked him now, no one smiled either. The realization settling over the room was too heavy for that. If Turner was right, then the war could be fought differently. And if that was true, then it had been fought wrong for far too long. Orders followed quickly, though they were careful in their wording. Turner's modifications were approved for expanded testing, not adoption, not doctrine, testing. Committees were formed, reports written, language softened, but on the ground, where survival mattered more than phrasing, mechanics began copying Turner's work, quietly at first, then openly. Turner worked constantly. He trained other mechanics, explaining not just what to change, but why. He insisted they understand the principles, not just follow instructions. He knew that misuse could be as deadly as ignorance. His hands ached. His eyes burned from lack of sleep. But for the first time since joining the army, his exhaustion felt purposeful. Pilots began requesting his aircraft by name. That made some officers nervous. Turner was promoted, reluctantly, as if rank might domesticate him. It didn't. He remained a mechanic at heart, more comfortable with engines than with salutes. His new insignia felt like a formality, something that existed to make others more comfortable with listening to him. Enemy intelligence noticed the change before command officially acknowledged it. Bombers were flying deeper, returning more often, sustaining damage that previously would have been fatal. Enemy reports described American aircraft that should not have remained airborne. Fighter pilots complained that bombers were maintaining power under conditions that once guaranteed failure. The war was adjusting. Turner's idea spread beyond the airfield. Other theaters requested information. Engineers refined the concept, adapting it to different aircraft models. Manuals were quietly revised, training programs updated. The language remained conservative, but the impact was anything but. Turner watched it all with a strange detachment. His idea was no longer his. It had been absorbed, institutionalized, stripped of his name. He did not mind. He had never wanted credit. He had wanted planes to stop falling out of the sky for reasons that could be prevented. Still, there were moments when the weight of it all pressed down on him. He would stand alone in the hangar late at night, listening to the ticking of cooling engines, wondering how many lives had been lost before anyone had bothered to listen. He didn't indulge the thought for long. Regret was a luxury the war didn't allow. The real test came months later, during an operation so ambitious it bordered on reckless. The mission required sustained high-altitude flight under extreme conditions. Success would cripple enemy infrastructure. Failure would be devastating. This time, every aircraft flew with Turner's principles embedded in its systems. The mission succeeded. Losses were still heavy, war always demanded a price, but they were survivable, sustainable. The difference reshaped strategic planning almost overnight. Long-range bombing became more viable. Escort tactics evolved. Air superiority was no longer limited by mechanical endurance alone. Turner received no medals for the idea. No headlines mentioned his name. The war had no room for that kind of story, but among mechanics, among pilots, among those who understood what had changed, his reputation became something close to reverence. They no longer mocked the mechanic. They sought him out. And somewhere deep within the machinery of war, a simple, overlooked idea continued to save lives, not because it was revolutionary, but because it was true. The moment Turner realized the war had begun to depend on his idea did not come with a ceremony or a promotion. It came quietly, in the form of a request that carried too much weight to be casual. A colonel he had never met before stood beside him in the hangar one morning and asked, without preamble, how long it would take to implement Turner's principles across an entire bomber group preparing for deployment. Not if it should be done. How long? Turner felt something tighten in his chest as he answered. This was no longer about improving reliability or reducing mechanical failures. This was about shaping strategy itself. The war had begun to lean on something born in grease and observation rather than doctrine. The pace accelerated immediately. Aircraft arrived in waves, each one demanding inspection, adjustment, recalibration. Turner trained teams of mechanics day and night, drilling them not just on procedure but on understanding. He insisted they listen to engines, not just measure them. He taught them to recognize the early signs of strain before gauges caught up, to respect the difference between theoretical limits and practical endurance. Some learned quickly. Others struggled, clinging to manuals as if printed words could substitute for judgment. Turner had no patience for that anymore. Lives were balanced on margins too thin for rigidity. Command adapted more slowly than the field. Official language lagged behind reality, describing Turner's work as optimization and incremental refinement. Privately, planners began redesigning missions around the new capabilities. Routes extended, altitudes adjusted, time on target increased. The ripple effects spread outward, touching escort tactics, fuel logistics, even how pilots were trained to manage stress on their machines. The air war was quietly changing shape, and most of the men making those decisions would never set foot in the hangars where it began. Enemy forces noticed. Intercepted communications and pilot reports revealed growing confusion. Bombers that should have turned back were pushing deeper. Aircraft damaged by flak were maintaining altitude long enough to escape. Enemy fighters complained of targets that refused to bleed power under conditions that once guaranteed failure. Intelligence analysts struggled to explain it. They attributed it to new engines, new fuels, new production methods. The idea that a mechanic's insight into usage rather than design could be responsible did not occur to them. Turner felt the pressure in subtler ways. Requests arrived faster than he could fulfill them. Officers sought his input on matters that went beyond mechanics. He was asked how long crews could safely maintain certain power levels, how weather would interact with engine stress over prolonged missions, how fatigue in metal mirrored fatigue in men. These were questions no manual could answer cleanly. Turner answered as honestly as he could, often prefacing responses with uncertainty. War, he reminded them, was not a controlled environment. The weight of influence settled heavily on him. He began to understand that every improvement carried a darker counterpart. Increased reliability meant deeper penetration. Deeper penetration meant heavier resistance. Longer missions meant greater exposure. Saving lives in one place shifted risk elsewhere. Turner did not shy away from this truth, but it followed him relentlessly, especially at night. He dreamed of engines running endlessly, of aircraft that could never land, of skis crowded with machines that existed only to extend destruction. One evening, a young pilot approached him near the hangar. The man had survived a mission that should have killed him, his aircraft returning with 2 engines barely functional. He thanked Turner awkwardly, then hesitated, searching for words. "Because of your work," the pilot said finally, "I'll probably fly again tomorrow." It was meant as gratitude. It landed like a question Turner could not answer. Enemy adaptation was inevitable. Within months, opposing forces altered their tactics. They focused less on inducing mechanical failure and more on outright destruction. Flak concentrations increased. Fighter formations adjusted to target bombers earlier, before endurance advantages could matter. The war responded to every change with another escalation. Turner watched the cycle with grim clarity. His idea had not simplified the war, it had sharpened it. There was an incident that stayed with him. A bomber group, newly modified, completed a mission that previous planners would have deemed impossible. They destroyed a critical target and returned with minimal losses. Celebrations followed. Turner stood apart, listening as officers praised improved performance, increased efficiency, strategic dominance. Later that night, casualty lists from another sector arrived. The enemy, adapting to losses elsewhere, had shifted resources. Ground troops paid the price. Turner read the names slowly, feeling the familiar weight return. He did not regret his work, but he no longer believed in clean victories. As Turner's influence expanded, so did the resistance. Not open opposition, those days were past, but bureaucratic friction. Committees questioned scalability. Reports demanded justification for every deviation. Some officers resented a mechanic shaping decisions once reserved for strategists. Turner navigated it carefully, answering questions without challenging authority directly. He had learned that the fastest way to bury an idea was to make it threatening. Despite everything, he remained grounded. He still wore the same worn boots, still worked with his hands, still listened more than he spoke. When offered a transfer to a planning unit far from the front, he refused. "I need to hear the engines," he said simply. No one argued. The war dragged on. Turner's principles became embedded so deeply that new personnel assumed they had always existed. Young mechanics learned them as standard practice. Pilots adjusted instinctively. The origin faded into obscurity. Turner did not mind. Ideas, he believed, should belong to whoever needed them most. Yet moments of recognition came unexpectedly. During a visit from high command, a general paused beside a bomber Turner had personally overseen. He ran a hand along the fuselage and remarked that aircraft losses had dropped significantly across the theater. "Whatever you're doing," he said, not looking at Turner directly, "keep doing it." It was the closest thing to praise Turner ever received from someone that high. As the war approached its final phase, Turner found himself increasingly reflective. He had changed how machines were used in war, but he had not changed war itself. Death remained arbitrary, survival remained unfair. His idea had tilted probabilities, nothing more. That understanding did not diminish its importance. On the contrary, it clarified it. One night after a particularly brutal week of missions, Turner sat alone in the hangar, notebook open on his lap. The pages were filled now, not with new ideas, but with refinements, marginal notes, reminders. He realized he had not written anything purely speculative in months. The war had consumed all space for imagination. Everything now was reaction, adaptation, survival. A young mechanic approached him cautiously, holding a notebook of his own. He had noticed something, an irregularity in wear patterns, a subtle inefficiency. He wasn't sure it mattered. Turner listened carefully, asked questions, encouraged him to keep watching. As the young man left, Turner felt something shift inside him. The idea that had changed the war had come from someone no one listened to. The cycle, he realized, had to continue. If the war depended on anything now, it depended on attention. As new fronts opened and old ones collapsed, Turner's work followed. Aircraft shipped overseas carried his principles with them. Entire squadrons operated under assumptions that would have been dismissed a year earlier. Enemy intelligence continued to misinterpret the change, searching for technological breakthroughs where none existed. The truth was simpler. Someone had paid attention. By the time word came that the war's end was approaching, Turner felt no relief, only exhaustion. He walked the airfield one last time, watching planes lift into a sky that no longer felt infinite. He wondered what would remain when the urgency faded. Would the lessons endure, or would complacency return? He suspected he knew the answer. Still, he hoped. They had mocked the mechanic. Then they had relied on him. And without ever fully realizing it, they had allowed a quiet idea, born far from strategy rooms and speeches, to reshape how the war was fought. The final reckoning had not yet arrived. But it was coming. The war did not end all at once. It loosened its grip slowly, unevenly, like a machine winding down after being pushed beyond its limits. Missions continued even as rumors of surrender moved through camps and airfields. Aircraft still lifted into the sky, engines still strained against physics, and men still died on days that history would later describe as almost peaceful. Turner remained at his post, working as he always had, because war did not recognize symbolism. It only recognized function. When the official announcement finally came, it was met with noise everywhere except the hangar. Cheers echoed from barracks, flares lit the sky, and men embraced in disbelief. Turner stood beside an aircraft undergoing routine inspection, listening to distant celebration while running his hand along warm metal. The engine ticked softly as it cooled, a sound he knew as well as his own breathing. The war might be ending, but machines did not change their nature overnight. Decommissioning began almost immediately. Aircraft that had survived hundreds of hours in hostile skies were grounded, catalogued, or dismantled. Turner watched bombers stripped down piece by piece, their engines removed and crated, their wings marked for transport or disposal. It felt like dismantling a living thing. Each aircraft carried scars that told stories no report ever would, patched holes, warped panels, repairs made under fire. Turner found himself remembering specific missions, specific crews, specific moments when failure had almost claimed them. He was offered a position in the post-war military structure, something clean and administrative, far from grease and heat. He declined. He had never belonged to institutions. He belonged to problems. Instead, he stayed on temporarily, assisting with transition reports. His work was now formalized, written into manuals and training curricula. The language was careful, stripped of personal voice. Principles became procedures. Observations became guidelines. Turner read drafts and suggested corrections, ensuring accuracy but never insisting on recognition. His name appeared nowhere. That was how he preferred it. As months passed, the airfield emptied. Crews rotated home. Mechanics departed with duffel bags and memories they did not yet understand. One by one, the people who had lived inside the war's machinery disappeared into civilian life. Turner lingered longer than most, reluctant to leave the only environment where his thinking had ever mattered so directly. One afternoon, a young officer approached him with a question that felt oddly out of place. "Do you think," the officer asked, "that if we'd known earlier, if we'd listened sooner, things would have been different?" Turner considered the question carefully. He had spent years avoiding it. Now, with the war receding, it demanded an answer. "Yes," Turner said finally, "but not the way you think." The officer waited. "We would have made different mistakes," Turner continued. "That's all." Civilian life came slowly to him. He returned to a world that seemed quieter, smaller, less urgent. Factories hummed with peacetime production. People complained about inconveniences that would have seemed absurd months earlier. Turner found work easily, industries valued his experience, but he never stayed long in one place. He moved from job to job, consulting, advising, fixing. He was most comfortable on shop floors, among people who understood that theory meant nothing without practice. Occasionally, he encountered veterans who recognized him, not by name but by reputation. "You're the mechanic," they'd say, "the one who figured it out." Turner would nod, deflect, change the subject. He had no interest in myth-making, myths simplified. His work had always been about complexity. Years passed. The world changed. Technology advanced. Aircraft grew faster, stronger, more reliable. The principles Turner had fought to be heard became so fundamental they were invisible. New engineers rediscovered them independently, confident in their novelty. Turner smiled privately when he read technical papers that echoed his old notebooks almost word for word. He never corrected them. On rare occasions, he spoke to groups of young mechanics or engineers. He didn't lecture, he told stories about listening, about watching patterns, about respecting machines not as objects, but as systems that carried consequences. He emphasized that most breakthroughs did not come from brilliance, but from attention sustained over time. "The war taught us that," he once said quietly, "we just don't like to remember it." Turner lived simply. He kept his notebooks, worn and oil-stained, stacked neatly on a shelf. He never published them. They were reminders, not relics. When asked why he hadn't written a memoir, he shrugged. "The work's already been done," he said. "Writing it down won't change that." In his final years, Turner sometimes visited airfields as a spectator. He watched modern aircraft take off, marveling at their power and precision. He listened, not with his ears now, but with memory. He knew that beneath the advancements, the same truths endured. Machines still had limits. People still pushed them. War, if it ever returned in full force, would still depend on those willing to notice what others ignored. On one such visit, a young mechanic approached him, curious but respectful. They talked briefly. The mechanic mentioned a small anomaly he'd been observing. Nothing major, probably nothing. Turner listened intently, asked a few questions, then nodded. "Keep watching," he said. "That's how it starts." The mechanic thanked him, unaware of the weight carried in that advice. Turner died quietly, years later, without ceremony. No flags, no headlines. His name appeared in no history books read by the public, but his influence remained, embedded in procedures, habits, instincts. Every aircraft that returned when it shouldn't have. Every crew that survived because failure had been anticipated rather than accepted. They had mocked the mechanic. Then they had relied on him. And long after the war ended, long after the machines he worked on were gone, the idea remained uncredited, uncelebrated, but enduring. Because wars are not only changed by generals or weapons. Sometimes they are changed by someone willing to look closer than everyone else.